Welcome back to Coffee Kurosawa, a podcast where a film obsessive and a film fan sit down to talk about the films that are important to us. My name is Ben Filipkowski. I'm your resident film obsessive.
And I am Farrah Sarpkaya, a person who loves film, but like in a super chill, I'm in need of a good cry kind of way. And today, we are talking about A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. So, this is one of those films I added to our list that Ben has not seen, or had not seen until we kicked this off. I, however, have seen it multiple times, and I adore it. Every time I go to watch it, I forget how much it makes me cry. Released in 2019, this film is based loosely off a 1998 Esquire cover story by Tom Janot, profiling children's entertainer and Presbyterian minister Fred Rogers, whose career spanned almost half a century and included multiple Emmys, books, a speech before Congress, and more. Directed by Mariel Heller and starring Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers, Matthew Rhys as a fictionalized reporter, Lloyd Vogel, along with a supporting cast including Susan Kelechi Watson, Chris Cooper, Enrico Colantoni, and Marianne Plunkett, the film is an intimate look at a man whose ministry touched the lives and hearts of generations of children across the globe. This film, much like the article it's based off of, is that intimate look into a man who may have been called a modern saint, but who made it his life's work to show the importance of love, grace, and acceptance, and that all of that could be attained by hard work. As always, if you don't want to be spoiled, press pause right now and go watch it. But make sure you've got a box of tissues handy, because you're gonna need them. This movie is rated PG for some strong thematic material, a brief fight, and some mild language. So, Ben, what did you think of A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood?
I really enjoyed this. I was delighted and moved by this movie. I just wanted to point out that I love that it is rated PG for strong thematic material, as though, like, the implication that you need parental guidance because you're going to cry so much because it's so beautiful. Uh, I loved so much of this movie. I loved the kind of use of the framing device of a Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood episode to kind of tell this story. I loved the constant use of the miniature inspired sets, the kind of like puppet sets that you would see on the TV show to showcase like establishing and location shots for the locations presented in the movie. The little miniature New York is beautiful. Fantastic to see that. But the thing that kind of stood out to me, uh, close related to the framing device and some of the other story elements in here, is that there's this thing in the literature world called magical realism. You've probably seen, heard, or experienced some kind of story with elements of magical realism in it. And the thing I couldn't quite shake through this movie is that you can kind of think of it as a gateway drug to magical realism in a fun little way. Magical realism is kind of this genre, big air quotes around the word genre here, that has this realistic depiction of the world, but with fantastical or magical elements incorporated almost matter of factly. There's no hard or fast definition for it. Uh, it is, I'm quoting a Wikipedia article here because I love the phrasing that they had on it. It's broadly descriptive, not critically rigorous. So you kind of wind up with really varied works that involve some, a few or many conventions of magical realism. Uh, Kind of to that end, there's a blurring of the sort of fantasy world that is present within the TV show of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Like there's not only there are kind of layers to it now that I think about it, because there is the show. Mr. Rogers comes in the front door of his house and he puts on his slippers and his cardigan. But then you also kind of get transported to the kind of more imaginative make believe realm within the show. Uh, and these things kind of live and breathe within this movie in to some extent, which is pretty neat to see, pretty fun to see. The the thing that really stands out to me, and I think we're going to talk about this a lot more later, is that there's this explicit moment where Lloyd and Mr. Rogers are sitting in a diner, and it's to me this is kind of like the the climax of Lloyd's character arc, where he is kind of confronted with like, hey, like let's just have a moment of silence. Let's just have this moment of silence together and just like, think about the people in our lives, people who've hurt you, and people who you've hurt, and forgive them. The silence extends outwards from them. It incorporates the entire diner, but then you also have Mr. Rogers explicitly speaking to us as an audience. So that's not strictly magical realism, but this idea that it spreads through the world that we're presented to, this very realistic world that we're presented to, kind of makes my mind go there. And then when it is that kind of explicit turn towards the camera, and he's telling us to engage in that moment of silence as well, we're tearing down the fourth wall entirely. There's no barrier between us as an audience and these performers. They're speaking directly to us, and it is beautiful. It's this wonderful, wonderful scene, and I love that it's not couched in irony or humor. There's not like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink quality to it. It's not about being clever and referential. It's about emotional honesty and connection. Yeah, this is just a delightful movie. The one other thing I really wanted to talk about in my first impressions here is, again, we will come back to this at some point, I'm sure. But Tom Hanks is not Mr. Rogers. He does not look like Mr. Rogers. He does not sound like Mr. Rogers. But you don't care because he just has this presence of being. He's nailed the kind of speech patterns, even if he does not actually have the same vocal inflections. And there's just that kind of innate warmth that we associate with Tom Hanks because we all love a good Tom Hanks movie. He plays these wholesome, upright characters who do the right thing. He's just like it works so well because it is Tom Hanks. I feel like if you got someone who was doing a more, uh, you know, quote unquote accurate impression, for lack of a better word, of Mr. Rogers, it just would not land anywhere near as well.
Yeah. He's not playing a character so much as he's like bringing to life a sincerity and an evocation
Hmm.
of that
Yeah,
feeling
he's
that Mr.
channeling.
Rogers brings us.
Yeah, he's channeling
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers. He's not pretending to be Mr. Rogers. He's
Yes.
bringing the right
Yeah.
energy. Do we want to? We should probably do a quick summary of this. I say quick again, air quotes around quick, because we tried to keep this brief. There's a lot going on in this movie, and it is really delightful to kind of engage with. So it's really hard to kind of just be like, oh, and some stuff happens. So I'll try and keep this one short. The introduction to the movie is, I think we kind of touched on this, a shot for shot call out to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers speaks to the audience directly about friendship. Mr. Rogers is kind of standing next to a picture board with 5 doors on it, and he opens three doors on this picture board to reveal familiar faces. Lady Aberlin, King Friday, and Mr. McFeely, who are, of course, characters from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Then he opens the fourth door, and we see the shocked face of intrepid investigative reporter Lloyd Vogel. He's got a cut on his nose and a black eye. This is weird. Like, this is a jarring moment because you're in this, like, oh, very dreamlike, very wonderful, wholesome. We're watching,
Nostalgic.
yeah,
Yeah.
nostalgic. And then this, like, hey, this dude got punched in the face. It's really jarring. Mr. Rogers explains that this is his friend Lloyd, and Lloyd's been going through some stuff. Mr. Rogers talks about the concept of forgiveness. I think he says, like, do you know what forgiveness means? I think is the line, something like that. It's a very Mr. Rogers, like, do you know what this concept is? No? Well, let's talk about it. It's really, really wonderful. But it also introduces us to the central thesis of this movie. It's all about forgiveness. We then cut to Lloyd Vogel, who is, as mentioned, an investigative reporter. He's got a bit of a reputation for being a jerk, focusing on more salacious profiles and stories. Like, he's kind of got a bit of a cynical streak to him. He is happily married to Andrea. They have just welcomed their newborn son, Gavin, to their world. Uh, Obviously, things are still a little stressed. You've got a newborn in the picture. They're trying to figure out work life balance and trying to figure out, can we just get this kid to sleep through the night? There's some stress there, but things are good. But there's an added stress in that Lloyd's sister has invited them to her wedding. This, in and of itself, is not a big deal, except for the fact that Lloyd's estranged father, Jerry, is going to be there. Uh, they're estranged for, admittedly, a pretty good reason. Uh, Jerry cheated on Lloyd's mother when she was dying of cancer, and Lloyd has never been able to forgive him. At Andrea's encouragement, they go to the wedding. The bad blood is such that Lloyd just can't get over it. Things get heated. A fight breaks out, which explains Lloyd's injuries that we see in the introduction. And when things cool off, Lloyd is back at work, and his boss tells him, "Hey, go write a story about Mr. Rogers. We need 400 words." Um, that is a shockingly small word count if you have ever written a single thing ever. But nonetheless, Lloyd's objection to this is, really? That's like such a snooze fest, easy. Like, what story is
Puff
there?
piece.
Yeah, it's a puff
Yeah.
piece. This is garbage. I'm not doing this. His boss pulls rank. He has to go do it. Lloyd kind of brings his own baggage to this. He's determined to figure out the truth of Mr. Rogers. He's determined to kind of reveal that everything we know about Mr. Rogers is a facade, a character, a creation. But at every turn, when he meets Fred Rogers, he is met with compassion, understanding, and honestly, fairly not prying questions, but fairly pointed, insightful questions that kind of turn the tables on Lloyd a little bit. He's kind of confronted with the reality that Mr. Rogers really is that great. So the movie that unfolds from this point is Mr. Rogers gradually getting Lloyd to open up and address his strained relationship with his father, Lloyd coming to terms with his anger by relating to Mr. Rogers' own experiences, and Lloyd's kind of process of not only accepting that his father is terminally ill, but coming to terms with what his father did and learning to forgive him. Uh, there's also a surreal dream sequence that occurs after a blow up between Lloyd, Jerry, and Andrea. Lloyd runs away, inadvertently abandoning his own family, kind of like Jerry did, but gradually recovering from shock and exhaustion with the help of Mr. Rogers. Lloyd returns home. He seeks forgiveness from his family, and then returns to Jerry's home, opening up and forgiving him in turn. The family, reunited, albeit with Jerry now in palliative care, is visited by Fred Rogers. Fred's delighted to meet everyone and thanks Lloyd for the story he wrote. Originally meant to be 400 words, but now ballooning into a 10,000 word cover story that I think there's a brief phone call where his editor phones him and is like, "No notes, you got the cover," and that is every writer's dream. Uh, there's a really touching scene between Fred and Jerry where Fred asks Jerry to pray for him, reasoning that Jerry, just being so close to death, is thus also so close to God. Jerry says a simple "count on it." I had to like pause the movie at this point to go like step away for a minute and not cry. That was a tough scene for me. The finale then cuts to Jerry's funeral, which is bittersweet because the family has reunited at this point, healed. Unfortunately, Jerry does pass, but the kind of love that kind of appears in the end here, we see the family grieving and healing and coming together. And finally, we return to that fifth door on the picture board, which Mr. Rogers opens, showing the happy whole family and a beaming at peace Lloyd. We close as the film crew exits the set. Sorry, as Mr. Rogers plays them off on the piano. When the room empties, on a moment of silence, Mr. Rogers slams lower keys as hard as he can, showing that beneath his calm exterior, beneath that compassionate exterior, is still a man with anger and frustration and sadness. Uh, he's always said, who just does the work. He closes us out, though, as he once did the filming back at PBS, and we fade to black.
So, the reason I really wanted to talk A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood for us is the fact that This is such a beautiful, fantastic example of a framing narrative. And at the end of the day, it's just a Mr. Rogers episode for adults. Because the audience that this was made for, the timelines match up to, you know, the people that grew up with Mr. Rogers, myself, our parents, are dealing with the death of their parents. They're dealing with having families and all of these things. And it feels so timely of Mr. Rogers came back. He was off the air for a while, and he came back because there were more things to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
There were more hard things to help kids deal with, and it felt like a coming back, even though it was Tom Hanks and not Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
But the incorporation of the introduction where he comes in, takes off his shoes, puts on his cardigan, the music, the miniatures, all of those things brought it to life in such a just a beautiful way for me.
Yeah, yeah. There's this really really beautiful way that the movie blends different mediums, different kind of metafictional, magical realism techniques. Like there is that again, of course, that element of like every establishing shot that we're seeing is like a miniature set, basically, very
Yes.
much in keeping with that the kind of the trappings of the show and the film stock or like the treatment of the image that we're seeing changes. So it goes from that clear, yeah, we're watching, we're watching film, we're watching something with a high quality, high image quality, shifts to, hey, you can see some of the grain on here from video, like the compression that you get filming for a video camera versus a film camera. I loved those little, the way that those things blend together. So you have the framing device is that more magical, realistic, more metafictional side of things, and the way that these things all collide and then all come together in that scene in the diner, where it becomes so much more explicit. Like there's no barrier between us and Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers, which means that there's no barrier between us and Mr. Rogers.
I also really like that it tells us what they're doing, too, because at one point earlier in the film, I believe it's one of the first times Lloyd gets to talk to Mr. Rogers, he says, part of what I'm doing is when I'm looking into that camera, I'm looking into the eyes of a child,
Mm-hmm.
singular child, making them feel special. And then that scene in the diner that we've mentioned where he literally stops. There's no music. And he says, think of all the people who have loved you into being. Now, that happened in real life. It was only 10 seconds and it was at the Emmys, but in this film, they take a full minute. And as Tom Hanks, as Mr. Rogers, looks into that camera and looks into your soul, if you're just watching casually, like even if you're like scrolling on your phone or whatever, the silence itself is enough to make you stop and pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And he really does a great job of making it feel like he is looking at you and at the child in you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something to be said about the way that movies play with our concept of time and our concept of place and things like that. The fact that when we're talking about Jaws and the concept of the one or the extended long take, lets us live in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But this is kind of similar in the sense that we're not living in a film moment. We are experiencing this minute ourselves. So it plays with how we are, our relation with time, with how time lets emotion, story, all these things carry forward.
And the fact that this is based off of an actual article written by an actual man, and that they aren't 100% true to it, means that they can do some stuff
Mm-hmm.
to also play with our idea of time while, like, Lloyd heals. Because that didn't happen in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Spoilers. Jeannot did not get punched by his brother-in-law at his sister's third wedding. But in the film, we see him slowly heal.
Yeah.
both literally and emotionally,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is just delightfully like on the nose. And I'm like, I see what you're doing, movie, and I'm here for it.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that uh, yeah, the way that like the story unfolds, the way that this would be a different movie entirely if they were a lot more straightforward with it. Like if it was very true to, yeah, we're going to talk about, Tom Janot's actual experience writing this article. Like we're just going to do that one to one. We're not going to really embellish. We're not going to change it. This becomes a very different movie.
Yeah.
And you lose something in that, I think. And to that end, I think it's also worth saying that, what am I trying to say here? I think what I'm trying to say is like the idea of adapting something, of making changes to serve a story. There's this sense of, if it's based on a true story, that true story must be amazing and awesome and worthwhile. But I think it's also worth noting that there can just be a kernel of truth in a movie based on a true story, and it doesn't make it any less valid because it is about the experience you have with it. To that end, the kind of artificiality of how they structure the story, of how they focus on forgiveness and healing, how those things are kind of invented wholesale for the movie, it just works so well. Like you would not have anywhere near as beautiful a movie as this without those elements in place. And simultaneously, if they had opted for that more traditional biopic route and gone for someone who looks a lot more like Mr. Rogers, who sounds a lot more like Mr. Rogers, at that point it becomes just an impersonation in some respects. But when you have someone like Tom Hanks bringing the weight of who Tom Hanks is in popular culture and popular consciousness, it becomes something else. And I think that's really incredible. And I think that that kind of ties in with a lot of this kind of metafiction side of things that fascinates me about this. The kind of how much of this is a construct, but how well it works as a result.
Yeah. And as we break down like the different parts, because there's a very clear arc here, both for as we get to know Mr. Rogers
Mm-hmm.
as a human and as a man, not just as, and as Lloyd puts it even in the film, there's Fred Rogers, the man, and there's Mr. Rogers, the character. And when he asks, Tom Hanks, Mr. Rogers, this question, he says, I don't understand. They're the same person.
Yeah.
And I think this film does a very interesting job visually showing us as we start to break away from he was as this like can the audience tell that I adore Fred Rogers, that he was this like icon, right? But also like how frustrating would it be if you were a person on Fred Rogers' set and he was spending an extra 45 minutes with the Make-A-Wish kid?
Yeah.
Like, I don't mean that to be mean, but also, like, I have to get home for dinner, right? Or, Fred Rogers spending all of his time shaking hands with everybody in front of the film studio, and his handler is just like, has perfected the handoff. And little things like that, where as adults who, are seeing Mr. Rogers, the character, but also seeing Mr. Rogers in context of that wider world beyond our comprehension of, like, real life, it brings the character to life in a way that I think a biopic would have kind of sullied a little bit, because it's giving us it's perfect show not tell, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Like the because when, yeah, like you're saying, Lloyd shows up on the set and they're delayed, and like the folks behind the camera, they love Fred Rogers, but they're like, we just gotta do it one more time. And he's talking to the, like, he's literally talking to the Make-A-Wish kid, and it's a wonderful scene because the kid is like almost standoffish in the sense, like, because like you're a kid meeting this figure that you've seen on TV. How do you react to that? And then at the end, the kid like engages with Mr. Rogers, and it is this genuinely beautiful. And it's a split second, but it's beautiful for that split second. And you can kind of see the crew have it's equal parts a moment of relief, but it's also like appreciation, their reaction to that. And then of course you have Enrico Colantoni as Bill Eisler, who is the handler, is the guy who keeps Fred on track in so many regards. Kind of comes in and he's like, "Oh, it's so wonderful to thank you all for coming to the set. It was beautiful to see you." But he's very like, "We got to get back to
Gotta
making the
get
show."
rolling.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's not that he's being mean. It's just that it is his job to keep the show going, and I love that it is his job to make sure that Fred is safe and secure. Fred is able to do these things. I also loved that there's the scene, and they're talking about the handoff, the way that Bill swoops in to kind of like extricate Fred and start shaking hands in his place, because Bill's the person who can just shut people down, but Fred cannot do that. And uh, and of course Lloyd is talking to uh, Fred's wife Joanne, and he asks her, "What's it like being married to a living saint?" And she's like, "I don't like that. Like, I don't like to think of it that way." And it's not a. She's expressing frustration with the sense that he doesn't work at these things. I think is my read on it. Like, there's
Yeah.
this beautiful idea that like, yes, like Fred Rogers is this wonderful beatific almost person, but it's not because it's an innate. He did not just arrive fully formed like this. This is something that he chooses to do, that he wakes up and puts effort into. And I loved that. That really stuck with me.
Yeah, because she says something to the effect of, like, it makes it unattainable if you think of him as a
Yeah.
saint,
Yeah.
right? Because not everybody can be a saint. And she says, like, he has a temper. He just chooses how he reacts to those stimulations. And the moments that we see in the film of Fred Rogers being frustrated
Hmm.
are so good because it plays again with that use of silence.
Yeah.
There's a moment where, like, um, Vogel asks Rogers, your son's it must have been hard growing up with Mr. Rogers as a dad. Like,
Yeah.
you're Mr. Rogers. And there is silence. And you can see Mr. Rogers looking at him, thinking about how to answer that question, and trying to. And Hanks did an incredible job in this moment of, like, showing, I want to answer this question because that's a very, maybe not rude, but, like, insensitive, perhaps, question. But he responds, "Thank you for considering that perspective." But you can see underneath him. And I hate to be, like, bleeding real life and, like, films, but I gotta wonder, like, Tom Hanks has been famous for a very long time. And I'm so curious if he reached down into his own heart for that. Because I can only imagine how hard it must be for the children of Tom Hanks to be Tom Hanks' kids. Because Tom Hanks, as you said kind of early on, right, is like this beloved figure in film. And imagine your dad is Tom Hanks and everybody loves him, right? Like, that must be hard too.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah. Well, that makes me think of, if you've never seen the movie Cloud Atlas, go
Mm.
watch it, because that is like a nice reminder that, yeah, Tom Hanks is an actor. He plays some
Yes.
bad people in that movie. Wonderful
Oh,
movie.
don't break my immersion here or my illusion.
Well, it's that is a wonderful movie because it plays with type in such an interesting way.
Yeah.
So that is actually a really interesting. That could be an interesting follow up to
Yeah.
this one.
Add
But
that to our list.
yeah, yeah. I loved that scene in particular because there is, you see that beat, and his expression doesn't change, but you can tell that he's there's a thought there, that there's something bubbling beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And I think that we can all relate to that idea of, I'm choosing not to respond to this, or I'm choosing not to feel a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a really powerful statement and thing to do. And I think that this movie is able to capture so many aspects of who Mr. Rogers is without actually being like he's a supporting character in many regards. Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
the thrust of the narrative is about Lloyd Vogel and his reconciliation with his father, but also to some extent how those issues are impacting his relationship with his wife and his own family situation. So the fact that this movie is able to mine so much from Tom Hanks being a co-lead, yes, but the supporting character in many regards is really amazing. And I think it was director Mariel Heller did bang up job. Like there's so much going on in this that all kind of just blends together in a really lovely way. It is metafictional without being cloyingly ironic. It is heartfelt without being saccharine. Uh, it's just what a delightful movie. Like I cannot sing his praises enough at this point. Also, I always forget that Matthew Rhys is Welsh and not American. He's very good at that accent.
Big kudos.
Yeah.
Yeah, God. I I think the Mr. Rogers as a supporting character is really interesting because if you think about I think it's like 837 or something episodes
Mhm.
of Mr. Rogers where he's talking to these individual children through the screen, millions of children through generations through the screen. It gives a sense, I think, of it's not it's it's not like, how do I put this? Lloyd Vogel was the main character
Yeah.
of this movie. The children were the main character of Mr. Rogers'
Hmm.
neighborhood, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think this movie brought that to life so beautifully with those moments of reflection because he says something to the effect of, and I think this is actually a Fred Rogers quote, where he says, anything that's human is mentionable and anything that's mentionable is manageable.
Yeah.
And this is really teaching us, how to navigate tough conversations, how
Yeah.
to navigate pain, but in a grown-up way.
Yeah.
But acknowledging that even grown-ups inside us, there's a little kid. Like, here's a spoiler for anyone in their teens or 20s listening to this. Grown-ups don't know what the heck they're doing. They don't.
Hmm.
We just have more references that we can pull from to be able to handle situations.
Wait, are we grown-ups?
And I maybe, I don't know, supposedly I've been around kids and they're like, I need to ask a grown up, and I'm like, me?
Yeah, I mean, like
I
yeah, I
am
have
I
a
qualified
mortgage.
for this?
I have a mortgage.
Yeah.
I'm married, but and I'm 34. Am I a grown-up? I don't know.
I don't think none of us ever grow up.
Yeah.
It's overrated. And that's really, I mean, a big part of this, where this is a movie for adults, right? But we start with that Mr. Rogers intro,
Hmm.
with the sweater and the shoes and the picture wall. And we have a little thing in the middle where we learn how magazines are made, and it's super cool. And
Yeah.
then we have clips of puppets, Mr. Rogers puppets. And we have songs, musical interludes, and all these different pieces of a children's show, which by all accounts you would think, oh, it's a movie for adults, but you have puppets
Yeah.
singing a silly song about feeling hurt. But in the context of that Mr. Rogers framing, it just fits.
Hmm.
It's just there. It's natural. It brings that framing fully alive to be, this is just a Mr. Rogers episode.
Yeah. Yeah. It, yeah, it's just so I don't even know how to like I'm clearly having trouble articulating some thoughts and feelings about this. I really enjoyed this. I was really surprised with how much I enjoyed this because I don't know that I usually go in for the overly wholesome stuff. I don't know what that says about me, but like every moment that you can see the moments in here that might be that might be played a different way. Uh, if this was a different sort of film, if this leaned into the more factual, grounded in capital R reality, uh, the bit on the subway, the New York subway, the kids see Mr. Rogers and they start the sing along of the theme song, and then everyone on the subway car is singing, and I was like, I was watching that, going like, oh, this is a little chintzy, and then 2 seconds in, I was like, no, this is actually beautiful. I love this. This is ridiculous.
And
This
it
is amazing.
happened.
Yeah.
It actually happened,
On,
which
yeah, that blows my
amazes
mind.
me.
On a New York subway, that every like you keep to yourself on the New York subway. Like anyone who's ever been on the subway knows that. But
Hmm.
uh, yeah, like it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and I think that this movie really mined those moments of beauty in such an honest and sincere way without ever. I don't think it really comes anywhere close to being saccharine sweet. It's never frustrating in its treatment of these things. I felt kind of carried along on this kind of like cloud of happiness for so much of it, which is remarkable because there's a lot of stuff in here. The entire relationship between Jerry and Lloyd is really tough. Uh, there's I think some pretty strong implication that Jerry was certainly emotionally abusive, at least insofar as withholding from his family and his treatment of them, certainly. Um, but I love that that central thesis of forgiveness is woven throughout all of it, and it's you can feel anger, you can feel those things. How do you how do you address those feelings? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of the saccharine, like not being too sweet,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have this framing of Lloyd is writing an article. So
Mm-hmm.
he's literally asking Mr. Rogers a bunch of different questions
Mm-hmm.
about what he does and how he does it, right?
Yeah.
And that's very much the tell in
Yeah.
the show Don't Tell,
Yeah.
right? But if it were a true biopic, we would have, right, a very clear view of Fred Rogers beyond just these little vignettes
Mm-hmm.
of who he was as a human. And it's less about who he was, like the details of his life, because like we don't learn about his time with the CBC.
Yeah.
We don't learn about his children. We barely learn about his marriage other than, how long they've been married.
Mm-hmm.
We don't learn about him as a man in terms of the details, which is
Mm-hmm.
what you would generally think of in like a profile in a magazine,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what we learn about, both through the questions that Lloyd asks and the moments of sweetness and his his impact of the world, that's the show.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie really brings it home with the power of a single person,
Mm-hmm.
um without telling us, because the premise of the article, right, is a an entire Esquire magazine worth of what is a hero. That's the premise. And Mr. Rogers is, quote unquote, just a children's entertainer. And yet, he can bring together generations and races and all of these different things in just the simplicity of being kind and being human. And if it were too sweet, if it were too, like, hammering on that fact, that would probably have been overdone. Because, like, then it's just like, oh, you're telling me all of this good stuff about this guy, and that's kind of like, you're overdoing it a little bit. But because we have this balance, it makes it that much more sincere.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah. I think a more traditional biopic approach would just be trying to cram everything about his life into a 2 hour movie. And
Yep.
that am I gonna complain about biopics right now? Yeah, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. Bohemian Rhapsody is a bad movie because they focus on the entire life of Freddie Mercury and how his career in Queen goes. But it would be far more interesting if you focus in on a particular chapter of an individual's life because you can use that to inform where they came from, who they became. Too many of these biopic movies about these notable figures try and tell us the entire story. And that these people are fascinating because they've led fascinating lives, but not every moment of their life is going to be illuminating or not. How do you fit all of that into one narrative thread that goes from like the start of their life to the end of their life? It's you're imposing you are interpreting their past to fit a narrative versus choosing a narrative from their life that is interesting, if that makes sense. I think that's my big frustration with a lot of biopics, especially Bohemian Rhapsody. Uh, Walk the Line was a great movie, was still guilty of this to some extent because you're still trying to jam in a figure's entire life into one thing, and that's tough. And I think this presents a different way of looking at it. Look at a single event or a single incident in their life to determine, to use that as a lens for who this person was to the wider public, why their story is important. I love that
Mm-hmm.
so much more than, well, we gotta get them at every chapter. We gotta get every chapter of their life in here. Like, sometimes you can just tell a short story. A movie should be a short story, not a novel.
Yeah. Well, I think too to that point, um the impact that Fred Rogers had on the world versus the impact that Fred Rogers had on individual people is a big part of this narrative because we're seeing it through the eyes of Lloyd Vogel, right? Because Mr. Rogers came into to Lloyd's life, and thanks to that, because of that, Lloyd learned to be a better person. You know,
Yeah,
well, we can put quotes around better because whatever that means as a human, but like his wife is happier, his child is happier, presumably he's a baby, but
yeah,
like his dad is more present. He has a better relationship with his extended family and all these different things, and it's just because one man asked Lloyd some questions
yeah,
and was genuinely sincerely interested in the answer.
yeah,
And as we're looking at this film as that Mr. Rogers episode, dialing driving back home that point of I am talking to the child on the other side of this TV screen, not children
mm-hmm,
plural. He
mm-hmm,
says I don't want to be a celebrity. I don't like that word, right? Because he's not in it for the fame and the fortune and the whatever. He's in it to make the lives of children better.
mm-hmm.
And like I already said, I guess we're all children at the end of the day,
Yeah,
somewhere inside, right?
yeah,
And that framing of that individual story, because life is not all sunshine and roses. Mr. Rogers certainly wasn't just all sunshine and roses, even though, he was a pretty cool guy,
mm-hmm,
I guess, Um, that brings it all the more to life
yeah,
because you are focusing very much, not even on the subject of the film, you're focusing on the people
yeah,
he impacted.
mm-hmm, yeah. Uh, I like what you're saying there because it's that idea of, yeah, like by focusing on the child on the other side of the screen, indirectly, yeah, you are shaping the world, but you're not. When the goal is not, I'm going to impact the world. I'm not going to. When the goal is not, I'm going to change the world through how I'm doing television. My goal is just I want to reach these children.
Hmm.
Indirectly, your goal becomes that not your goal, but your result is that you have changed the world. That's just that's the knock on effect of it, and I think it's really lovely that they kind of articulate that so beautifully in this movie.
There's a Tumblr post that I saw once upon a time that was like people in like in science fiction get so worked up about what could happen if they step on a butterfly and change the future that they come from. People forget that they exist today. And the little things they do could change the future in the future. And it's a small tangent, but this movie, I think, brings to life the power of that one person to change the world. And it's not just Mr. Rogers. Because, like, all the people around him, including Lloyd, take steps in their growth and development to be kinder, be more helpful, bring people together, all these things. And in that way, extends that message of, like, we can change the world together. And to be terribly, I don't know, overly sentimental, perhaps, it almost feels like the movie is less about Mr. Rogers and more about the message, right? Because it's, like, we didn't learn all that much about Mr. Rogers, but we were reminded that how much you can change the world. You, the person listening to this podcast right now, can change the world by being kind.
Well said. There are two things that I wanted to two final things that I wanted to mention about this. I loved at the end. Lloyd is talking to his wife Andrea. They're walking Gavin in his little stroller, and they've kind of reconciled from their challenges from the Lloyd running off in his kind of manic moment of exhaustion, of stress and anxiety. They've reconciled from that. He has asked for forgiveness and received it. They've reunited as a family, and they're walking, and he says, if you wanted to go back to work, like he's basically saying, like, you can go back to work. I'll be the stay-at-home parent. And I think he says, like, Gavin and I talked about it and we agree. And I'm like, oh, my heart. I love that moment. It was very sweet. And then on a very different note, when Mr. Rogers visits the family and visits Jerry when Jerry is, in palliative care at this point, Lloyd's new brother-in-law is like just blurts it out. He's like, "Were you a sniper? Like, were you a sharpshooter in the army?" Because that's like that for years. You grew up in the 90s, early 2000s. That was like the thing that you heard as like the urban legend was that Mr. Rogers,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he's so kind, but he also killed 100 men. Patently untrue, but I love that they put that kind of weird urban legend in here so that they could politely shoot it down. No pun intended.
I think in terms of, as we kind of wrap up this bit,
Mm-hmm.
the last thing I want to bring to the table is the fact that, so we've talked about how we introed it with the intro to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but we don't exactly close with the outro.
Yeah.
So we have that moment where he takes off his trainers and puts on his loafers, and he takes off his cardigan and puts on his jacket and says goodbye and see you tomorrow. And he plays us off on the piano as the cast leaves. We kind of talked about this in the beginning. And he slams down hard on the lowest keys on the piano and show us yet again that Mr. Rogers is human and has feelings besides this picture perfect, like, I don't even want to say facade because that's wrong, but like this persona that people ascribe to him.
Mm-hmm.
And we, the adults watching the Mr. Rogers episode that has been created for us, are reminded again that it's okay to have feelings and be sad or angry, even when things are going well.
Yeah.
And I think in the breaking of that frame, the breaking of that episode, it brings us home to cut out that overly sweetness,
Mm-hmm.
and it lands on, again, no pun intended, an excellent note. Because it feels very human
Yeah.
and very intimate.
Yeah. What a good movie.
Such a good movie. All right. So in our closing summary, in our last 5-ish minutes, Ben,
Yeah.
if you want to learn something about film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, what are we learning? What do you want to look for? What's up?
I think that if you want to learn about uh, the so-called weirder aspects of film and narrative and structure, like all those little metafictional twists and turns, this is a great introduction to a lot of that because of how the, just because of how it is structured, the stuff that we've talked about the framing device, about the breaking of the fourth wall, the blending of medium, the blending of reality is done in such a way that it all feels natural and appropriate, but it's also doing it in such a way that it draws more attention to the structure of the story and our relationship with it. And I think that this is such an incredible primer for those elements that you can kind of take with you and look at other movies out there uh, with kind of the lens that you've taken from this. I think that, yeah, watch it for those reasons. Watch it because you love Mr. Rogers. Watch it because you love Tom Hanks. Watch it if you just want to feel good. It's a great movie. Farah, what? Why would you recommend this movie?
So, for all the reasons you named on the latter half,
Yeah,
of if you love Mr. Rogers, if you love feeling good, if you love feeling sad and just need a good cry, and also, if, like me, the world feels like a lot sometimes, and sometimes you just need someone to tell you that it's gonna be okay. And, you know, you are an adult, but also you're a kid at heart, and the world can be scary, but you got this. This is a movie for you.
well said.
Yeah. So, after all that, Ben,
Yeah.
where can people find you?
Find me at Cafe Cartography. We also have a Facebook profile set up for this podcast, which, as of the time of this recording, is still a work in progress, but hopefully won't be by the time you see it. Farah, where can folks find you?
Folks can find me at Farrah Sarpkaya on Instagram. And you can find me on Threads at the same. You can find me at my website, sarpkaya.ca, if you like the sound of my voice and want to hire me to narrate things and various other activities. And that's about it. So next time, I believe we are talking dinosaurs, for which I'm very excited. Jurassic Park is up next.
Yeah.
And I can't wait for you to tell me everything about how they made those, animatronic dinosaurs, and also wax poetic about how incredible John Williams is. Again.
Yeah. Looking forward to it. And in the immortal words of Was Not Was, open the door, get on the floor, everybody do the dinosaur.
Incredible. Thanks, everybody. And won't you be my neighbor?